Right here on this stage last Sunday, Brandon and Chastity were married. It was the very first day of their life together, and I think it's neat this morning that we celebrate 68 years for Cleo and Marilyn. And I can only imagine that 68 years from now they would want something like what you guys have. And so it's just a beautiful thing, and it ties, I think Colin is absolutely right, it ties so well into the series that we are in right now. We're in a series called Real Wisdom for Real Life, and it's just all about how important wisdom is for every single one of us in your everyday life. And it's a series based out of the book of Proverbs, and we're just going to camp out here for the summer, for most of the summer, and our goal is real simple. Our goal is to come to God and say, God, make us wise as we read your word and as we apply the things that we have learned. Make us wise and teach us how to live life right. And I feel like the one thing our culture understands, whether you're a believer in Jesus or not, is that they want to live life right. They want to get the most out of it. They want to avoid as much danger and pitfalls and pain as possible, and they want to do things in such a way that will bring life and flourishing in their family and their jobs and all over their lives. And you know what? That's what wisdom is about. Wisdom is God's truth applied to our everyday lives so that we might find the best that He has for us by obeying the commands that He has given us. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I challenged you to read through the book of Proverbs through the summer, and I said to do it at half a chapter at a time because I thought this would be a brilliant thing for us to do together as a church and to grab onto something and grow together. And so when you see each other other places, you can remind each other and talk about the things that you have learned and the passages that you have been reading together. And the goal has been, my challenge to you has been, is while you're sitting beside the pool, while you're sitting there under a tree relaxing this summer, all you got to do every day is read half a chapter of the book of Proverbs. It'll take you the summer to do 10 to 20 verses. It won't take you more than 2 or 3 minutes to do. And at the end of that experience, pick one of those proverbs, one of those one-liners, and decide that this is the one that I'm going to think about today. This is the one that I'm going to chew on. This is the one I'm going to let soak in to me today. Whichever one spoke to you, whichever one caught your attention, whichever one sparked your imagination, just grab onto that one piece of truth, that one nugget of wisdom, and hold on to it for the day. Now, the reason why I only gave you half a chapter to do every day is mostly because sometimes I worry in the summer that if I give you too much homework, you won't do it. So you can all do this together. And if you are late in the challenge, it's not too late for you to jump and to dive right in. You can catch up in no time at all. Half a chapter a day, think about your favorite verse, and let it sink in. The reason why I challenge you to do this is because, first of all, the number one way in which you're going to obtain wisdom is from the Word of God. But the second reason why I've asked you to do it slowly is that as I've studied it this year, I've realized that I've been reading the book of Proverbs wrong my entire life. I've been reading the book of Proverbs wrong ever since I started, and the single reason why is that I've been doing it too quickly and not reading it slow enough. I was thinking this week, we went water skiing with my cousin Josh once, and we were just teaching him for the very first time how to water ski. And I remember my dad, he looked at him as he was in the water, and he said to him, whatever you do, don't let go. Has anybody water skied before? In his mind, the number one danger for a new water skier is they would get nervous, hands would get slippery, and they would let go. So all he thought is, I got to drill this into his head and say, whatever you do, whatever happens out there, do not let go of that rope. Some of you have been water skiing before, haven't you? So he took it to heart. This was the piece of wisdom that was passed on to him, wisdom. And as he laid back and he sat back, he did everything right. The boat roared to life. It pulled him out of the water, and for about 3 or 4 seconds, he was doing famously. He was skimming right across the top of the water. But then something happened, and he leaned just a little bit too far forward, and then he face planted into the water. Now, for any normal human being, this would be the end of the story. For any regular person, all they would do is what? Let go. But he had been told by my father, his uncle, who had never led him astray before, he says, whatever you do, don't let go. And there we were on Red Rock Lake with Josh skimming across the top of the water for 150 feet, face first, like this. It took that long to get my dad and shout at him to slow down and stop. And I was thinking about that story just a little bit this week, and the reason why I thought about it is this. First of all, you got to give him credit. Somebody gets an instruction like that, he was committed, full-fledged to this process. But when I think about that image, I think about the way that a lot of us read the Bible. We skim across the top at full speed. We plow our way through. We got to get through this many chapters in this many days. I got to check the box so at the end of the year I've finished reading the Bible. And yet we don't do the one thing that we need to do to experience it, to actually get in. So I want to challenge you with the book of Proverbs. Just don't skim across the top. Don't drink from the fire hydrant. Slow down this summer. Do half a chapter a day. Pick one verse and let it soak in. Let it do the thing that it was supposed to do. Because wisdom doesn't come quickly. Wisdom comes slowly. Wisdom comes with thinking and chewing and imagining. Let it become a part of you. Let wisdom grow inside of you. So this morning, I want to talk to you about the single most important proverb in the entire book. There are hundreds of proverbs, one-liners in this book, written mostly by King Solomon. We're going to talk this morning about the one that is more important than all of the others inside this book. This one proverb is so important, this nugget of wisdom is so central that it is the key that unlocks the wisdom in all of the other proverbs that you are going to read throughout this whole enterprise. And if you don't understand this first one, if you don't do what this first one says, if you don't pay attention to the truth that's inside it, all of the other riches of wisdom that are in this book will stand on the other side of a wall and you won't be able to access it. This is the one verse that scholars and theologians say the entire book of Proverbs is built on. And what it is the difference between a wise man and a fool. This one proverb is going to tell you and me today the difference between a man who is wise and a woman who is wise versus a man who what the Bible calls is a fool and a woman who is a fool. And it is not where they went to school. It is not how smart they are. It is not what their IQ number is or any test that they have ever taken. It's not even the collected amount of experience that they have in their lives. It is one thing. Do you know what the difference between a wise man and a fool is? It's what Solomon calls the fear of the Lord. The dividing line that dichotomizes these two people, that splits and divides them, is this one thing that the Bible calls the fear of the Lord. How many of you have heard of that phrase before, the fear of the Lord? We're going to talk about that this morning. We're going to dive deep into it because Solomon says this. He says, if you want to understand the rest, you must understand this first. This is what it says. Proverbs 1 verse 7. You'll see it on the screen here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. Whatever wisdom is, wherever we are going to find it, it begins with this thing called the fear of the Lord. So what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to live in this thing called the fear of the Lord? Have you ever wondered that before? I think that this phrase is a tough phrase for a lot of people. I think a lot of people who have been followers of Jesus for a long time, they hear a statement like this and they hear a phrase like this and there's a whole bunch of things inside of them that they just think, I don't know, that just doesn't sound like the relationship with God that I have. Does anybody in here have that feeling? You see, usually the word fear for us is a negative word, isn't it? And we think to ourselves, I thought fear was the thing that God sets me free from. I thought fear was the thing that God drives out because perfect love drives out fear, the New Testament says. I thought the thing that we were supposed to run to God whenever we were in trouble and share with Him whatever is going on in our hearts. I thought fear innately was a bad thing. So how in the world can fearing God be the beginning of wisdom? Have any of you wondered that before? These are great questions, and if these are your questions, that's okay. They have been some very, very faithful followers of Jesus' questions as well. And the answer to these questions lies in what Solomon means by the word fear. And what we're going to find out this morning as he uses it over and over again, and as we listen sometimes to the way that he uses it in the book of Proverbs, you'll realize that he doesn't mean what you think he means. Now, I read this amazing story that kind of helps illustrate this a little bit about President Teddy Roosevelt. You all know President Teddy Roosevelt? As a young boy, his family used to go to church every week, faithfully go to church. But all of a sudden, one day, Teddy got deathly afraid of setting foot inside the church that he grew up in. Just deathly afraid. His mother would ask him what was wrong, and he would not even set foot alone inside this church. His church was called Madison Square Church. And nobody could figure out what happened in Teddy's life and why he became so afraid of this church that he used to be so comfortable in. So one day his mom sat him down and she said, Teddy, what's going on? What are you afraid of? And he said he was afraid of something called the zeal. Do any of you know what that is? The zeal? Teddy was afraid of something inside the church that was called the zeal. And he said it was crouching in the dark corners of the church, ready to jump at him if he so much as turned away. And his mother was entirely confused, as parents are often with young kids. And she couldn't figure out what he meant. And so she said, Teddy, what do you mean by the zeal? He says, I don't know exactly what it is, but I figure it's some sort of large animal like a crocodile or a dragon. And then to prove his point, he says, I even heard the pastor read about it from the Bible. So by the way, parents, if you have kids, you never know what they're taking away from Sunday morning. Even the simplest Bible stories can concoct and coalesce into the weirdest imaginations that they might have. So be prepared for some weird questions as your kids grow up in the church. But he heard the pastor read right out of the Bible about this thing. So his mom brought out a concordance. It's this big book that has all the uses of the words in the Bible. And she started reading one by one of the passages that had the word zeal in it. Until suddenly she read one and Teddy got all excited and he said, that's it, stop right there, that's it. And it was John chapter 2, verse 17 in the King James, and this is what it said. It said, and his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. And as I pictured this, I got such a kick out of it. I got such a kick out of seeing a kid walking carefully around the corners of the church, wondering if in that corner behind that pew lurked the zeal that would end his days long before they ever got started. Now, those of you that know what the word zeal means, it's not a monster at all, is it? What does it mean? It means passion, right? Zeal means passion. It means passion for the Lord. And not only is the zeal not a bad thing, it's not really a thing at all. Passion for God is something good, something that should be desired, something that we should be pursuing in our everyday life. Not only is it something that we shouldn't be afraid of and doesn't sound like a good thing to a 10-year-old boy, it is a beautiful thing. Do you know what? It is exactly the same with the phrase, the fear of the Lord. At first glance, it might drop all sorts of connotations that you might not understand, but as you dig into it, you'll find out that it is a beautiful and a wonderful and a powerful thing once you understand what Solomon means by it. It is a life-changing realization that if you can let it settle into you, will change the course of your life and the way that you make decisions from here on in. Solomon says it is the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge. So what is it if it's not an animal crouching in the corner of the church? What is the fear of the Lord? I'll give you my definition of what it is that we're going to work from here, and this is what it is. The fear of the Lord is being actively aware of the power and the presence of God in every situation. The fear of the Lord is actively being aware of the power and the presence of God in every single situation of your life, everywhere you go, everything that you do. It is not running scared away from Him. It is not worrying about what will happen if you get too close to Him. It is simply being aware of God's immense power and His immense closeness to us in everyday life and in every situation that you have ever been in. And then it means living in that reality and making your decisions, saying the kind of things that you say and doing the things that you do in light of the fact that God is big and that God is right here beside you. Now, don't get me wrong. If God were to appear in this room right now, blazing in all of His power and all of His glory, you may well be tempted to fall over. You may well faint. I don't want to belittle that. The men of the Bible that met Jesus or that met God face to face, John the apostle, he fell over as though dead, Revelation says. Isaiah was overcome with himself and the holiness of God. Moses stood beside the burning bush and was afraid for his life. If you were to see God with all of the blinders back and not even being concealed in one way, shape, or form, He would stun and awe you in a way that you have never been stunned and awed before. But the fear of the Lord that Solomon is talking about here is not exactly those types of experiences. Because the fear of the Lord that Solomon is talking about is an everyday kind of experience, something that happens to you in the morning when you wake up. Something that you carry with you when you go to work, something that you take with you when you're with your family and friends, something that you hold on to at night when you go to sleep, something that informs the decisions that you're going to make tomorrow and how you spend your money and where you pay your bills. The fear of the Lord is a daily experience and a daily awareness of two things, the power and the presence of God. How many of you have ever been to Niagara Falls before? It's a pretty amazing experience, isn't it? To stand near something that majestic and that powerful and that beautiful, it'll take your breath away. And if you were lucky enough to go behind the falls as they walk through that channel carved into solid rock, you can stand there from me to that first pew away from millions of gallons of water falling per second. And when you stand there, those of you that have been to Niagara Falls, were you afraid of the falls? Did it make you want to run away from the falls? Did it make you want to get in your car and get as far away from this place as possible? What did it do? It drew you in, didn't it? Not too close, I hope, right? But it drew you in. And I remember as I stood there and I could almost reach out and you could feel the mist and the wind and the thunder that it was in front of me. I was respectful of what was in front of me. I understood what was in front of me. I didn't want to do the wrong thing in what was in front of me, but I was not repelled by it. I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame because of its majesty and beauty. And if you think about the fear of the Lord like that, you will think about it differently every time you read it in the Bible. It is something that draws you in instead of something that repels you away. It is trust and respect for something that is awesomely powerful and awesomely close. Now you see, if you think about fear, this is going to be a really neat illustration for some of you. If you think about fear, fear always requires these two things. So if you've ever been afraid of anything in your life, there were two things that were evident in that moment. There was power and there was presence. There was power and presence. So how many of you know in Brazil, they have some pretty big snakes. I don't know if you've ever been to Brazil, but they have some large snakes. Some of you, I can tell already, don't like snakes. There are some snakes in Brazil that grow to be 20 or 30 feet long, about from me to Mitchell back there at the sound booth. 20 or 30 feet long. These snakes are 8 to 10 inches thick at some points, and they just slither around there in the jungle, and they could kill a man like that. Wouldn't even be hard for them to kill a man if they could so much as wrap themselves around. Now, how many of you woke up this morning afraid of snakes in Brazil? Did any of you wake up this morning and check outside your door because of snakes that were in Brazil? No? Did any of you check the news just to make sure that there wasn't a plane carrying snakes from Brazil that accidentally opened up over the top of Chatham-Kent? Was that a fear for any of you this morning? Nobody, right? Why aren't you afraid? Why aren't you afraid of those snakes? Do you know why? Because they are powerful, but they are not present. Do you see? They are powerful. There is no question about whether or not they are powerful, but they are not present with you right now. So none of you woke up this morning afraid of snakes because even though they are powerful, they are not present right here and right now. So let me ask you this. If you woke up tonight in your bed and there was one of these 20-foot pythons with you, would you be afraid? Would you be afraid? Yes. Why? Same snake, because now it's present. Do you understand? It can be powerful, but if it is not present, it is no concern for you. So this snake is no longer on TV. It's not in a documentary. It's not a nature show. And all of a sudden, it's inside your bed. And now you're terrified. I apologize for all the nightmares that I may cause from this illustration tonight. Power and presence. One of those two things is not enough to make you afraid, but both of them is. So let's flip the story. Let's say you wake up tonight, in the middle of the night, you wake up, and beside you is a tiny, fluffy baby kitten. I know, right? Isn't that cute? Snuggles up to your face. If you woke up tonight and there was a tiny baby kitten beside you, how many of you would be afraid? Nobody, right? Unless you're allergic or you have some weird irrational fear. You would not be afraid of a tiny little kitten inside you. Why aren't you afraid? It's present right there with you. Why are you not afraid? Because it's not powerful, right? It's not powerful. There is nothing that kitten can do to you other than pounce on your toes under the covers as you move them just a little bit. It has presence, but it doesn't have power. Fear always requires these two things, power and presence. And here is why we fear God. Not because He is evil, not because He is angry. We fear God because there is no one more powerful and no one more present than Him. Do you understand? This is why it's called the fear of the Lord, because there is no one, no thing, no situation, no circumstance that is more powerful than He is. And believe it or not, there is nothing closer to you than He is as well. There is no one and nothing that is more powerful and more present than Him. And just like Niagara Falls, it is something that you are drawn to because of His beauty and His awesomeness and His power and His glory. It is not something that drives you away. But when you stand in the presence of something that powerful, fear is the natural human reaction. Because there is nothing more powerful and nothing more present than Him. And this is what Solomon is teaching us. He says that if you want to gain wisdom and knowledge, if you want to live life right, it starts nowhere else than right here, that God is more powerful than anything in all of creation. And He is right here with you right now. And there is nowhere that you can go that is outside His presence. Reverence and awe for who God is and how involved He is in every aspect of life is what the fear of the Lord is. Being aware that He is powerful and that He is present in every situation you are in, every single day. Knowing that He is there with you at work, right there beside you. He's there with you at school. He is there with you when you are watching TV. He is there with you when you're with your friends. He is there with you when you sleep at night. He's there with you when you wake up in the middle of the night terrified. God is with you in all of His power everywhere you go and in every situation that you find yourself in. Even on vacation, at the bank, everything that you do, God is there in all of His power and all of His glory and all of His presence. Andy Stanley, when he defines the word sovereignty, he says this: God is large and in charge. It's a good definition, isn't it? God is large and in charge. God is on the throne. There is no one bigger. There is no one stronger. He is large and in charge always. And living in the fear of the Lord is simply orienting your life around this simple but powerful truth that there is no one more powerful and no thing more powerful than Him, and there is no one closer to you. If you can start to understand this, if you can start to think about this, if you can start to experience this in your everyday life, this is the beginning of wisdom. You will never find wisdom if you do not start here. This isn't just step one. This is the gate by which you will enter into the life of a wise man or a wise woman. That this is who God is and that this is where God is. That is where wisdom begins. Now, the flip side is also true. Solomon says that what makes a man a fool is not how smart he is or how educated he is or how experienced he is. He says what makes a man a fool is any man who calculates his life without God in the equation. A fool is the man who tries to figure out the world that he lives in without God in the equation, who tries to understand nature without God in the equation, who starts to understand human behavior and make plans for the future without God in the equation. A fool is the man who simply says this. Psalm 14:1 says, in his heart, it says, the fool says in his heart that there is no God. There's a bulletin board somewhere along Highway 40 that has this and has it for a long time. The context is different, but the truth is powerful. The fool says in his heart there is no God. There is no room for God. This is what Solomon says breeds folly. This is where folly begins. This is eventually what will lead to all of the wrong decisions that you will ever make, is if you begin your day, begin your circumstance, your experience with the idea that there is no God involved or present here. So what does that practically mean for you and me? What does it mean to actually live in the fear of the Lord? How do we make ourselves aware of the presence and the power of God in our everyday situations? Well, it means that the key to overcoming most of the things that you and I struggle with on a daily basis, the key to victory in a lot of the fights that you and I are in our spiritual lives, is simply remembering these two things: how big God is and how close God is right there and then. How powerful God is and how close He is to you and me. And the key to slaying the dragons of fear and stress and anxiety, the key to overcoming life's hurts and habits and hang-ups, the key to defeating sin in your own life is making yourself aware of the power and the presence of God. That He is large and in charge on the throne, and that He is in the room with you right there and then. So let's take fear, for example. I'll give you a couple of examples. When it comes to fear, the crazy thing about fear is, and I know you've experienced this before, the crazy thing about fear is the more you stare at a problem, the bigger it gets. Am I the only one that's experienced that before? The more you stare at a problem, the bigger it gets. Doesn't matter what that problem is, doesn't matter how it came into your life, the more you stare at it, the more you think about it, the larger it gets. The more you dwell on it, the more you talk about it, the more you worry about it. That problem that started 2 feet tall eventually grows larger than your house, and when it's that big, you just have no idea what to do with it anymore. The more you stare at a problem, the more you focus and dwell on it, the bigger it gets in your life. And do you know what happens inversely? The larger that problem gets in your life, do you know what happens to God? The smaller He gets. The more you stare at that instead of staring at Him, the bigger the problem gets and the smaller God gets. The more you stare at how close that problem is to you, the bigger that problem gets. And all of a sudden, God seems further and further away. Mel and I have been facing a situation back home that has been one of the more stressful situations that I've been in. We at one point were ranking all of the most stressful situations in our life, and afterwards Mel said, "Why are we doing this? How about we don't talk about all the other bad things that have ever happened in our life when we're dealing with one right now? Let's just deal with the one that's in front of us." But we were dealing with a situation that was so stressful that I felt sick to my stomach for days. I can't remember that happening for a long time. Thankfully, there's a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel in this situation, but I found this principle at play every time I thought about it, because every time I dwelt on it, do you know what happened? I walked away feeling worse. Every time I stared at it, I walked away feeling smaller and more scared than I did before. The more I focused on it, the more it grew until it not only took up my days, it started to eat into my evenings and into my weekends, and then it would eat into the early hours of the morning. Does anybody else wake up early and think when they're stressed? Well, 5 o'clock, me and you were up, and I don't know what you were thinking about, but I know what I was thinking about. And I remember having this conversation with Mel about this, and if you could have somehow cross-sectioned my brain even 2 weeks ago, if you could have somehow cut in there, I know there'd be all sorts of crazy stuff inside, but you know what you would see? You would see 90% of my brain was encroached on by this problem. 5% of it was trying to keep myself from falling asleep during the day because of how tired I was. And there were a whole bunch of drumsticks in there, ice cream drumsticks. Just a whole bunch. You know what? I only had one 2 weeks ago. I'd never had one before, and it has changed my life. So even in the midst of this crazy problem, there was still a little bit of space left for that. 90% of the real estate in my brain was this problem that was worrying over and over and over and over and over and over. And if that sounds like a lot, you should see inside my head, it was a scary place to be. Here's what I found. Every time I went to dwell on the problem, it got bigger and God got smaller. Every time I went to dwell on the problem, it got closer and God got further away. And this is always the way it is with fear. This is always what happens. And the two things that I was forgetting invariably throughout the last 3 weeks were this: God is bigger than this, and God is closer than this right now. God is bigger than the situation that I am facing, and He is closer to me than even the problem right now. What are those two things? Power and presence. Every day I would wake up and I would go look at the problem. I would promise Mel I wouldn't, but I would do it anyways. And when I would come up from downstairs, she would look at me and she would say, "What were you doing?" And I would say, "Nothing." But we both knew what I was doing. Every time I felt worse. And as I was watching this happen inside of me, it wasn't just that the problem was getting bigger, it's that God was getting smaller. And here's the thing, this is why the fear of the Lord casts out all other fear. Don't miss this. The reason why the fear of the Lord casts out all other fear is because there is nothing bigger than Him and nothing closer than Him. So no matter what that problem is, it is invariably smaller than He is and further away. This is why the fear of the Lord drives out the other fears in your life, because when you awe and respect and focus and dwell on the power of God and the closeness of God, everything else in your life starts to fade away. Proverbs 19:23 says this. If we have more time, I would dig deep into this. The fear of the Lord, you can see it up here. The fear of the Lord leads to life. Then one rests content, untouched by trouble. How many of you want to be untouched by trouble? The fear of the Lord leads to what? It leads to life. Then one rests content, untouched by trouble. And if you can make the fear of the Lord a part of your life, it doesn't mean that trouble won't come. It means that trouble can't steal the contentment that God has given you, because He is in the rightful place in your life. The fear of the Lord leads to life. And then one rests, sleeps through the night. That's what the passage means in Hebrew. Sleeps through the night content, untouched by trouble. Think about forgiveness, for example. Jesus says we don't forgive each other sometimes because we've forgotten how much God has forgiven us. We won't forgive that person who has wronged us because we have forgotten just how big and how close God is to us. And He even told a story about it, a parable about a man who owed the king millions of dollars, and the king forgave him. And then he walked right out of the palace, found his friend who owed him $10 and had him thrown in jail. And Jesus says the reason why you won't forgive that person half the time is you forget how much I have forgiven you. You forget how big He is and the debt that He has already paid, that Jesus paid on the cross. You forget that. It has gone out of your mind, and you forget that He is standing there right beside you as you grind out that grudge. As you think about what you're going to say to that person when they come into the room next. As you think about a way to get out of whatever trap that they have entrapped you in. As you sit there stewing in this, do you know where God is? Right here. He's right there. The same God who forgave you of every mistake that you had ever made, and every offense, and every wrong choice. He is right there beside you as you stew and smolder. Do you know why we don't forgive? Because we forget. We forget how big and how close He is. Finally, when it comes to sin, we pretend like God can't see us. Anybody pretended like God can't see them before? Zoe is our little tiny tornado at home. I'm sure you've figured that out by now. And we hope by the time that she was 6 years old that she might grow out of the property damage phase, but she's just getting better at it at this point. I don't really know what happened, but it's always the young one that you don't have eyes on, that you walk into a room and you're just like, oh, Zoe. We were hoping that things would get a little bit better. One of the funniest things lately that we have been doing with her is she's been drinking from the hose outside. You're all going to get mad at me for saying this, but apparently, according to the internet, who always knows, that hoses have a whole bunch of chemicals in them, and you're not supposed to drink the water that comes out of the hose. So I'm sure all of you will live who grew up doing that. I did too. We're going to make it through the day. But we've kind of made a rule at home that says, Zoe, please don't drink out of the water, out of the hose. It's just not good for you. Who knows what's been inside there? It's just don't drink out of it. So she won't, unless she thinks I'm not around. And we have these big windows in our family room, and I stand there in the family room because of the way that the sun shines and the shade that's there. I stand there and I watch her. I don't say anything. I just watch her. And she looks around like this. She crawls up to the hose. And she looks left and right and up and down and everywhere. She grabs the hose, and then she starts to drink. And I don't say anything. I wait till she comes inside, and I say, Zoe, why were you drinking from the hose? And she says to me, how did you know I was drinking from the hose? And I said, Zoe, Mom and Dad always know. Mom and Dad can always see you wherever you are, whatever is happening. Mom and Dad will know about it. So you better be careful. And I know that that's entirely untrue, but the longer she thinks that's true, the better for all of us. Okay? I said, Mom and Dad are always watching you. So when she knows I'm watching her, she won't do anything wrong, mostly. When she thinks I'm gone, oh, then things change. I hate to say it, but you and I are exactly the same. We are exactly the same. When we think that God is far away, it's not so hard to choose that thing that we know we're not supposed to choose. When we think that God is not in the room with us, it's really not so hard to choose that path that we know has gone wrong before, and we know that God has led us away from, but it seems so easy to go down right now. When we think that God isn't there with us, you can say the things that you really want to say, even though Jesus said not to say them. Sin starts to happen when we forget that God is big and He is right there beside you. Do you remember I asked you before if you would watch the same TV shows and watch the same movies if God was sitting on the couch beside you? Do you remember that incredibly awkward question that I asked you? Would you choose the same kind of entertainment? Would you say the same things? Would you tell the same jokes if Jesus was sitting right there beside you? I have news for you today. He is. He is. He always has been. He always will be. There is nowhere you can go, not the depths of the earth, nor the furthest points of all creation where He is not. So He is right there beside you. And if you want to fight sin, you remember that in that moment. You think about that. You remember this thing that Solomon calls the fear of the Lord. I want to give you a challenge today. I want you to challenge yourself this week to start making yourself more aware of God in your everyday life. Maybe it's hard for you to imagine God outside of Sunday mornings, but I have news for you. God actually is relevant and present with you outside of the hour and a half that happens here on a Sunday morning. When you're at work tomorrow, God is there with you. When you are playing with your friends, with your kids, doing the things that you do, God is right there with you. And for some of you, the number one thing that you can do walking out of today to make yourself wise is to break God out of the Sunday morning box that you have Him in. It's to break Him out of this box that you keep Him in and say, God, this is your time on Sunday morning, but the rest of the week, that's my time. You got to let God out of that box. No borders, no boxes. And my challenge for you to do this week is to grow in this thing called the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. And I want to do it using the phrase of a famous monk from the 18th century. I don't often quote monks from the 18th century, but this guy is pretty cool. He was a famous monk who lived in a monastery his whole life in and around France. And he did this thing that he used to call, he built his life around this thing called practicing the presence of God. Anybody heard of that book before? Practicing the Presence of God. I bet you've practiced a lot of things in your life. Have you ever practiced the presence of God before? The monk's name was Brother Lawrence, and he lived in this monastery in France, and he never really did anything that made him famous except write this one little book. And the reason why he wrote it was there were all those people around him that kept realizing how amazing his relationship with God was, how simple, how joyful, how profound his connection with God was. And they would always ask him, Brother Lawrence, how do you do this thing that you do? How is God present everywhere with you? How are you so close to him? And it was this thing that he wrote the book on called Practicing God's Presence. And this is what he would do. He would bring God into every area of his day. Every activity that he would do, not just at church, not during his morning devotions, but every part of every single day. And it wasn't just the quote-unquote spiritual things that he invited God into. It was every part of the day. When he went out for a walk, guess who went with him? Jesus went with him. When he was sitting down at the end of the day, guess who sat down with him? Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, he was a monk at a monastery. Obviously, everything is spiritual in a monastery. I bet his job was all about Jesus. Do you know what his job was? He was a cook. And not only was he a cook, he was kind of low on the totem pole, so all day long, the thing that he did more than anything was wash dishes. He was a dishwasher. And here's the thing, he managed to bring God even into the mundanest of tasks, like washing the dishes. Now, I've watched my wife wash a whole lot of dishes in our time together, and honestly, there are very few things that she likes less than washing dishes. I'm not sure if there's any other moms out there, but laundry was even lower on the list. Laundry was the worst. But even lately, we've been washing an extra number of dishes because our dishwasher broke, and I took forever to get a new one, so for 3 weeks, everything has been hand washed. And you know what? I'm sure that there are times that she doesn't look at those dishes and think, oh, this is going to be a spiritual experience. Like, we're going to have a real God moment right now. But here's what she does. She throws on some praise and worship music, and she blares it in there like it shakes the walls of the kitchen sometimes. I wasn't sure why she had it so loud, and then I figured it out. I think she's trying to drive out the demons of dirt and grime or something. There is some method to this madness, but she'll just turn those praise and worship music up all the way. And here's the thing. She finds a way to bring God even into the simplest of tasks. She finds a way to bring God even into these mundane, routine things. She goes into battle against those dishes with Jesus by her side. And I assume that is exactly the same thing that Brother Lawrence would have done. Maybe he thought, maybe he prayed, but he did something. And here's the thing, everywhere he went, he'd cook meals, he'd run errands, he'd scrub pots, he would do it with Jesus. And so my challenge for you going forward this week is simple. When you're gardening out there, do it with Jesus beside you. If that sounds crazy to you, I want you to try it. I want you to do this thing called practicing the presence of God. And if you're saying, Pastor, you don't know my life is crazy, I don't even have a moment to think, this is going to be hard. Have you met my children? Like, I don't know how I'm going to practice God's presence in the middle of my kids screaming in my face, but that's why it's called practice. You got to work at this to bring God with you everywhere you go and involved in everything that you do. Invite him while you garden, because you know what? God's actually a pretty good gardener. Invite him while you're driving along the road. He's pretty good with directions. Invite God to go with you everywhere you go. And when you face fear, when you face trouble, when you face temptation, picture the God of the universe and all of his power and glory standing right there beside you. Practice the presence of God. Let's pray. Father God, we are forgetful creatures. C.S. Lewis once reminded us that we need to be reminded more often than we need to be told. And here is the truth, God. We may know you are big, we may know that you are close, but remind us of that this week when we need it the most. God, I pray for anyone in here that is struggling with fear or temptation, that is struggling with anxiety or stress. I pray that you would teach us as a church to practice the presence of God, to live in the reality of a big God and a close God. And once that fear of God takes hold inside of us in all of its beauty, it will dispel everything in its wake. In the powerful name of Jesus we pray. Amen.